and welcome to the Castle Talk podcast, where we talk to writers and creators of today's genre worlds. From Denver, Colorado, I'm your host, Jason Henderson, author of the Alex Van Helsing series from HarperCollins. Tonight, Laura Bickle grew up in rural Ohio, reading entirely too many comic books out loud to her favorite Wonder Woman doll. That's delightful. Her work has been included in the ALA's Amelia Bloomer Project reading list and the State Library of Ohio's Choose to Read Ohio reading list. Following on the heels of her critically acclaimed prequel novels Dark Alchemy and Mercury Retrograde, now comes the first installment in Ms. Bickle's dark contemporary fantasy series, 9 of Stars. It's in a series called Wildlands. So welcome, Laura.
Thanks so much for having me.
I am so excited to talk to you. Okay, so are you in Ohio right now?
I am. I'm in Columbus, Ohio.
Now, I've only been to Ohio once. I was in Columbus, and I ended up going to a drive-in movie theater. It was in Marion. It was in Marion, Ohio. It was an old one.
Well, we actually do have one in town. It's not been in operation for many years, and it's actually a flea market now. But I love drive-ins. I remember the first movie that I saw at a drive-in when I was a little girl was Star Wars. So I wish they were still around because they were a lot of fun.
You saw Star Wars at the drive-in. I do remember seeing Star Wars in the original. We went to the movie theater. We were like at North Park Mall in Dallas, Texas. And those were the days when they made movie theaters really small, so that basically if it was a big movie like that, people just sort of lined up around the block for days. Have you noticed people don't do that anymore? It just doesn't happen anymore.
Well, now you have cup holders and seats that recline, and you can order food, which I think the ordering food part is pretty cool. I enjoy that myself.
Oh, this is all an improvement. Yeah, absolutely. The shoebox theaters of the 1980s and 70s were really tiny and cramped, and there was barely any tilt to the floor. No. I have no nostalgia for those days. I mean, yeah. But
I have a little bit. There was a theater in Parkersburg, West Virginia. I grew up in a really, really small town in southeastern Ohio, so for fun, we used to go to West Virginia. But there was, I think it was in Parkersburg, there was a little theater like that. It was called the Burwell, and they tore it down maybe 15 years ago. But I remember it had all these Art Deco bits of gingerbread, and it had those teeny tiny little seats that squeaked, and you couldn't even really breathe because the seats would squeak. But I thought it would be really kind of a cool thing if somebody went in there and did some salvage, but I don't know if anybody really did.
Well, the theaters went through this interesting thing where, like, sometimes if you're in a small town, you can come across a really cool old theater, that's like clearly an old concert hall or something like that got converted into a theater, and in the 40s you had these amazing movie houses, and I've seen some of those in Chicago. But then, like, when I was growing up, no, movie theaters were hideous, horrible shoebox things with the seats like you're talking about. You could hear the next movie over, so you'd be watching Star Wars, and like Phantasm would be next door, and you could hear the guy getting killed by the Silver Sphere, and that was what it was like until, like, I was getting out of grad school, where all of a sudden they invented the amphitheaters. I mean, to our younger listeners right now, all of this is just blah 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 blah. None of this will mean anything to them. All right, here's what I want to ask you about. You've created this new book, 9 of Stars, is about a character called Petra D. She's the star of the previous cycle of books that you wrote, right? And it's her and her coyote Sid. Can you explain to me, who is this character who's the lead in your books?
Well, I wanted to write a character who was totally unmagical, who is not the chosen one, and who is kind of an everywoman. Petra D reminds me a lot of Agent Scully from the X-Files in that she is a scientist. She's a geologist, and she is a total skeptic at this little town, Temperance, Wyoming, on the outskirts of Yellowstone, and the town was founded by an alchemist about 150 years ago. And the alchemist disappeared under mysterious circumstances, but he left some of his alchemical experiments wandering the countryside. So she encounters some of these supernatural creatures and leftover experiments, and it really just makes her noodle when she runs across them. Things like undead cowboys and basilisks. And in this book, she's dealing with he's kind of a spirit of an old trapper. His name is Skinflint Jack, and he is a failed alchemical experiment that he's kind of a a cross between a stag and a human, and he's hunting wolves in the back country of Yellowstone. So Petra and her coyote sidekick, Sig, are out to stop him.
Do you do scenes from the perspective of the coyote?
You know, in my very first draft of the very first book of Dark Alchemy, I had this. I thought it was a lot of fun. I did the perspective from the coyote and also a raven. And I thought it was a lot of fun, but it didn't make it in.
It didn't make it. I mean, I noticed that you've got early in this book a thing from the perspective of a rather sweet little wolf who encounters Skinflint Jack the first time, and that's told from an animal's perspective, which I thought was really cool. But I totally understand the notion of, you include stuff in the draft, and it doesn't make it all the way through. Sometimes because the editor goes, you know what, I am being your commercial reader here, and this isn't working for me. Have you ever had to make huge changes in a book when the editor comes back at you with edits?
I don't think I've ever really had to make huge changes. Most of the time, the way that I work is I work from a synopsis or an outline. So usually if it's an editor that I'm working on an ongoing project or a series with, I'll have 3 or 4 pages of an outline so that he or she, pretty much knows what's happening, and we've kind of agreed. And, that's not to say that there aren't going to be some surprises along the way for me, but usually I want to make sure that the idea has legs, or if I'm working on my own, I give that to my agent and we hash it out, and she, who is the lovely Becca Stump at Prospect Agency, by the way, plug for her. But, she'll be honest with me, and she'll say, this has been done before, or, there might be something about it that doesn't really have legs. And I appreciate that kind of honesty because, nobody wants to waste months or years on a book that is not going to be well received by readers, or that somebody else has already got in the works,
Absolutely.
So.
Gosh, but that would be really frustrating if you were like working on something and then somebody's like, oh, well, it turns out that there's already 3 other, I'm going to make this up, like Sherlock Holmes meets Jack Kennedy books this year. We don't need any more Holmes Kennedy books. So I'm sorry you spent a year working on that.
Well, this is not to say that I don't have a ton of books that live in shoeboxes under my bed that that I've worked on that just it's not the right time, or I haven't found the right home for, or not every book that an author produces, of course, is going to be successful in getting sold, but I kind of like to try to at least not have any surprises with the folks that I'm working with.
Oh, absolutely. So what are the challenges in creating a new series? I mean, so for instance, Harper Voyager is presenting this book as the first in a series called Wildlands. I mean, what do you have to think about in creating a new series that it seems like that would have some particular challenges to it?
It was super challenging, but I was super excited to do it. It was a lot of fun. I was initially thinking that this would be the 3rd book in a series, but we decided to go ahead and relaunch it as the first. So I had to make sure that the plot structure and the events would make sense to somebody who is just jumping into a book, for the first time without having read the prequels. So I actually snagged a couple of beta readers who had not read the first 2 books and said, "Give it to me straight. Does this make any sense?" And worked from there. And also, one of the ways that I particularly like to work is, I do like having long character arcs and character development that occur over 2 or 3 books. But I also like having a self-contained story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, kind of a monster of the week kind of thing. And there's just something I find to be kind of satisfying about that.
Well, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just thinking, So do you intend that somebody could like pick up a book and then a different book and you don't have to read them in order, or do they definitely have to be read in a certain order?
I don't think they have to be read in a certain order. I mean, I include just enough background information so that folks aren't lost. But each book deals with Petra D as the primary protagonist. But there are some other different characters in the book, like you were mentioning the wolf character, Nine, in Nine of Stars. She was not in the previous 2 books. And so it's kind of fun to be able to deal with a new cast with every book.
Yeah.
As well as bring back some of the old favorites.
I think I actually, to be perfectly honest, this is just my personal opinion. I vastly prefer that to a tightly knit series where you must read, because to me, the goal is to have create series where you could in theory have 20 of them. There need be no end to James Bond. The Reacher novels can go on forever. you know Dean Koontz killed off Odd Thomas, spoiler, but the fact of the matter is he could probably unkill him, and just
Good.
do 13 more. And to me, that's the way books ought to be. I really just want an endless series of it until the author just simply goes, I can't do this anymore. Patricia Cornwell is on something like, if I want to guess, her 20th or something Kay Scarpetta novel, and that even
Yeah.
that might not be near. Yeah. So you might have something going here. You could just kind of keep churning out Petra D until you're ready to retire, and
I would love that.
and then your
But
estate can choose somebody to finish your last unfinished Petra D novel, and then people
oh,
can debate
sure,
about
sure.
that.
Well, I think part of it is growing up. I grew up in a small town, and we'd go to the next town over to the newsstand where I would pick up paperback copies of the Star Trek books, and there was no
Oh
way
yeah.
I could read them in order because just sheer availability. But it
Well,
was
they're not
nice
meant
for
to
me.
be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that was a lot of fun for me.
Is that what you read? What is that what inspired you?
I
Like,
don't. I
what were
think the
you
book that
reading?
Oh, well, I read a lot of Star Trek, but I think the thing that really inspired me in terms of fantasy was when I was about 12 or 13, I read Robin McKinley's The Hero and the Crown. And
Mm.
this was the first fantasy I had consumed that had a female protagonist that actually went out
Mm.
and slew her own dragons. Before that, my exposure to fantasy had been or fictional fantasy. I'd read a lot of mythology, but
Sure.
you know, most of the women were just kind of sitting in their towers waiting to be rescued, and there wasn't really much going on, and I couldn't really get into it a whole lot.
Hmm.
But that, I think, was a big exposure for me. And a couple other things, too. My mother was a school librarian, and I would go in to work with her in the summers when I was a little girl. And I
Yeah.
would sit in this really sunny corner, and there were all these, like, dust motes and stuff. It was really kind of a magical corner. But the
Oh.
mythology books were there, and I devoured all of the mythology books on the shelves. So that was really, huge for me in developing a love for fantasy. And the third thing, which is the most bizarre thing, again, being in a small town and being a child of the 80s,
Yeah.
Masters of the Universe was the big thing when I was a child.
Yeah.
So my
Sure.
brother and I got Castle Grayskull, I think it was in 1982 or 1983, for Christmas one year, and that was the thing. So robots, aliens, the whole shebang.
You're
It
talking
all
about a
has to
play
go in there.
set, right? Like a big plastic
Yeah.
play set of the
Mhm.
Castle Grayskull. That's pretty
Yeah.
cool. Yeah.
Oh well,
Wow.
hey.
So you did pretty well as a kid. That's that's that's
Hey.
very nice.
Had the Star
Wow. So,
Trek books, had Castle Grayskull. What more do you need as a kid?
but other than Star Trek, those are pretty high fantasy that you're talking about. I mean,
Mhm.
He-Man ultimately is a high fantasy story, just sort of boiled down for Filmation cartoons. But those are dragons and swords, and yet in
Mhm.
your own books, you're in a world of modern investigation and weapons and so forth. So how do you think that I, I'm just wondering, why did you veer into what we might call, I don't know, urban fantasy or rural fantasy, or whatever the hell you want to call fantasy that takes place today?
I like rural fantasy. I'd like to to borrow
You
that.
coin that, yeah.
That's great. I at some point, I've got like a couple epic fantasies in shoeboxes underneath my bed. At some point, I'd like to wander into epic fantasy territory. But I think the really cool thing about contemporary fantasy is if you're building a closed world where not everybody knows that there's something magical or supernatural afoot, you
Hmm.
can dabble in a bunch of different genres. You can dabble in Weird West. You can dabble in horror. Um, and there aren't quite so many rules.
Mm.
So I have
Interesting.
the yeah,
Do
yeah.
you feel like there are stifling rules on high fantasy that or epic fantasy that don't apply in the Weird Western?
I think that there are some tropes that I know and love, like the stranger coming to town and who's wearing the black hat and who's wearing the white hat.
Yeah.
But I think both urban fantasy and as it's evolved to be, and epic fantasy. I mean, there's some heavy expectations going with those genres in terms of the cycle of the story and the perspective and content, and you're going to have a romance here and those types of things that I don't feel quite so constrained by if I'm dabbling over here in Weird West. If that makes any sense.
That's really cool. But that's because it's literally the frontier. I mean, as a genre, it's kind of the frontier. People still haven't quite decided what those tropes will be. I mean, I assume that that's the case.
I hope that's the case because, yeah.
Because you're breaking the rules.
And that's something wonderful. I've got to say that I really appreciate about Harper Voyager is that my editor has really encouraged me to think outside the box. And like for the first book, Dark Alchemy, I had the ending all wrapped up in a nice little bow because I thought, well, I'm selling this as sort of an urban fantasy, and it has to have this kind of ending to fit within the genre. And my editor said, no, you need a darker ending. And I'm like, yes! Awesome. I have the opportunity to, really get in here and do something a little bit different. So I've really been excited with the editorial help I've gotten on that and the freedom to play, really.
That's fabulous. Now the character, Petra is the main character, but this is a third-person book told from multiple points of view. Isn't that right? I mean, I know that Go ahead.
Yeah, it is, and that, again, that's something that most urban fantasies tends anymore to be first-person perspective all the way through with the same character. But I wanted to play with that. I wanted to hop into some different heads. Again, I want to get into a wolf's head and play a little bit.
Sure. I confess, I've talked to people. I've never actually tried first person before. Everything I've ever written has always been, multiple POVs, chapter to chapter, third person. But and occasionally I'll run into some first person. Dean Koontz, like I say, Odd Thomas. Those are written in first person, and it always strikes me as an interesting challenge because, of course, it means that your guy has to be present for everything that happens of import, or else the people feel ripped off by the fact that they missed out on whatever exciting thing happened where your first person character wasn't there.
I think it's kind of different.
Oh, good.
No, you're absolutely right. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Anyway, but you were going to say you think it's something.
Oh, yeah, I'm thinking that, we get so used to looking at television that is usually from multiple perspectives and getting used to scene cuts and things like that kind of bleeds over into writing. I mean, I've done first person. I did a couple of YA books that were very much horror, very Amish versus vampires. And I did it from the perspective of a young Amish woman. And it worked for that story, but it doesn't really work for all stories. So yeah, it's fun to have the freedom to
Amish versus vampires. I actually love the idea of Amish versus vampires. That's they certainly got a lot of wood. They've got all this they can take apart the buggy. Wow, if the Amish were vampire hunters, then Pennsylvania would be like vampire no man's land. They would just steer clear of there and yes, stick to Kentucky. Because Kentucky, the one thing Kentucky is missing is vampires. All right.
I don't know about that.
Okay.
I need to actually get a definitive opinion on that because, I don't know.
Whether Kentucky has vampires?
I don't know if Ohio has them either. I mean, I think that we need to do a state-by-state survey in order to be certain where the vampires are and where they're not.
I assume you're writing the next Petra D novel. So tell me, when you're trying to meet one of those deadlines, I ask everybody this because I'm always interested in the answer. What is your process? Are you trying to knock out a certain number of words or pages in a given week, or what are you holding yourself up against?
Well, actually, my deadline is February 1st, so there are no holiday cookies for me.
It's about 40 days from now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. So what? I am painfully aware of this, but usually what I do is, like I said before, I start with an outline, so I generally have an idea of where I'm going, and in the months leading up to it, I use a calendar. I mean, I get great security in knowing that, hey, if I'm meeting my word counts every day, I know that I can get there from here. And, occasionally, I've got to throw down with some fellow writing friends and do some trash talking and do some word wars. I'm in the middle of one right now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I'm getting my butt kicked, but that's okay because I'm on schedule on my calendar.
You mean in trying to, so how much of the, like you have 40 days left, how much are you supposed to, first of all, are you supposed to turn in a first draft or like a draft you've been through a couple times?
It's going to be a draft I've been through a couple times. Yeah.
Okay, so basically you've got 30 days. How many words do you have to get done in the next 30 days? I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I'm actually
No comment, in case my editor is listening to this. No comment, David. It will be in on time, and you will love it, I promise.
So here's the thing. What I was thinking about was I go to a lot of middle schools, right, with the Alex Van Helsing books and other stuff. And one thing I always teach these kids, and I mainly say it just to hear myself say it because I think I myself need to remember it, where I'll give them a simple, very simple test where I'll say, okay, imagine that you've got 2 months to turn in an 80,000 word book. 80,000 words in 2 months. That means in a month you need how many? And they're smart. They go, okay, well, in a month we need 40,000 words. I go, okay. So if you need 40,000 words in a month, then how many do you need in the next 2 weeks? And they go, 20,000 words. And I go, okay, so if you need 20,000 words in 2 weeks, how many do you need by the weekend of this week? And they go, 10,000 words. And I go, 10,000 words by the end of this week. And that means that you probably need, whatever it is, a little over 1,000 words a day. And I said, so if you make it to the end of this week and you don't have your 10,000 words, can you make the 80,000 at the end of the 2 months? And they kind of shrug, and I go, maybe, but I may tell you, if you blow off the next 2 weeks, there's no way. Today counts. Today is part of it. If you let today go by, you'll never get it back. You can't, today counts. And that's it's my favorite thing to remember, actually, and it's very helpful in writing books. But
and I really like that, and that goes to what we all go through as writers, and I really try to encourage people to do National Novel Writing Month at least once.
Oh my gosh, have you ever done that? I've never done it. I've never done that before.
Yes, many times, yeah. And I had NaNoWriMo books published, and I really think for me it was a big help because I had this epic fantasy that I worked on for years and years and years, and I just would plink with it for a little bit and I'd put it away, and I'd plink with it for a little while more and I'd put it away, but I never got to the end of it. And then there was a friend in my writing group who challenged me to do NaNoWriMo, and I thought it was just pure lunacy. I mean, 50,000 words in a month? Are you crazy, woman? But she
right,
said,
and
no, you can do it.
Don't they make it like 13? They suggest that turns into what, 1333 a day?
Yeah,
right?
Something like that. Yeah, somewhere around 1,500 words a day ish. Yeah, and I
you've
thought,
done it.
This is lunacy. This is lunacy, right? Yeah. But the thing for me is it helped me to get my inner editor out of the way, because I have a horribly brutal, doubting inner editor that will just pound me into dirt if I don't find some way to circumvent that. So that kind of taught me that, you got to get the first draft out on the page. It may completely suck, which is why you don't turn that into your editor. And then you work it, and the grace is in the reworking for me. So.
Well, at least you're working from an outline, though. So you get to, in other words, having an outline to work from that you already have other people who've agreed more or less that that's what's going to happen. I mean, there can be deviations, but that means that in theory, you're not going to get 3/4 of the way into the book and then suddenly be racked with a decision factor of, do I throw out everything I was planning and go off in a different direction from what I thought? You're not going to do that because you've got I assume that you're not going to just pull the rug out from under your writing that way.
Since I started doing outlines, no, that's never happened, but I have occasionally had some deviations where I've gone, man, I hope my editor is on board with this. I could ask permission, but I'm going to go ahead and try it out anyway and see if they say anything.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I'm just assuming that there's a little bit of freedom left
Oh yeah.
or not freedom, that's not the word. I guess freedom to move fast. The freedom to make real progress comes in at least having a plan. You've sort of mapped it out. But I agree. I've done that myself where I decided, you know what, I'm going to kill this character. I hope that turns out to be okay. It wasn't in the original outline.
Exactly.
And so bye-bye, beloved mentor. We've we've enjoyed you for a couple of books. So anyway, gosh. Well, the new book is brand new. It comes out on the 27th of December. You might be listening to this on the 27th of December, but regardless, the book is new. It's from Harper Voyager. It is called 9 of Stars, and it is in the Wildlands novel from that dangerous writer from Ohio, Miss Laura Bickle. It has been really fun talking to you. I've really enjoyed this. It's very inspiring to me.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that, and I'm wanting to trademark your coining of rural fantasy.
Rural fantasy.
It's
Boy,
been a lot of
think
fun.
about that. Rural fantasy, think about like all the things, like the cloud of ideas that comes into what rural fantasy would be, I mean, there could be, it could be everything from like those Duck Dynasty guys, only they would have like magic powers of some kind,
Mhm.
and yeah, there could be like an evil hee-haw. I don't know. There's
Evil
Roy
hee-haw, I
Clark
love it.
shambles from the grave just to attack us with his 10-string guitar. So, all right. Thank you very much. Have a fantastic evening, and I will talk to you soon.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.